This talk came out from kind of thinking of all the questions I get asked about election security and my experiences doing election security related stuff for one of the major platforms. So these are the 5 questions I sort of like dashed off when the CFP came out, and then I wrote the answers to them in the last couple of days. And they're mostly opinion questions, opinion answers, but you can at least know what my answers to these questions are. So who am I? If you don't know me, I am in Google's threat analysis group. We do understanding, countering serious threats, government-backed threats, financially motivated, disinfo, but it's all about serious threats. And we consider threats to the election process, to elections, to be some of the most serious threats we deal with. So we put a lot of effort and energy and prioritize looking at these threats very heavily. And we've been doing this a number of years. I've been in this team for over 10 years, so I've been through a few election cycles in not just American, but other election cycles. And just last year we actually came out. We were one of the first people saying that we saw significant targeting against the campaigns from both China and Iran, not Russia. And we went public with that. So hopefully this says why I'm able to speak about this topic. So the first topic I'd say when you do election security stuff is welcome to the circus. I'm in charge of all the threats we deal with, none gets more attention, more focus, more people wanting to be involved, more politicians, journalists, everybody else interested in the topic, and also more people just wanting to help. So it turns, which can be great, it gets you a lot of resources, gets you a lot of energy, means that you can get things done, but it also means that there is a lot of churn, chaos, meetings. I've made jokes that the growth in number of people having meetings about election security has grown much faster than the number of people actually doing election security. So when do you call a cyber attack election related? So basically, I'm talking about this now because it's not an major election year. In a major election year, I probably get asked about 3 times per day on average what TAG is seeing for election-related threats. And my flippant answer is always, what do you mean by election-related threats? How are you defining that? And I think it's an important question because, at one end, you've got the real purists who want to say that it's only if you're trying to actually hack voting machines and election infrastructure and trying to actually change votes, that's election hacking and everything else isn't. I don't buy that because that kind of knocks out things like DC leaks and Macron leaks and major cyber operations from major governments that actually are trying to have an effect. But on the flip side, I've seen people just wanting to get into the game, wanting to get their PR, so anything tangentially related to a elected official also gets kind of put in this election bucket. And I don't buy that either, right? If you think about it, we all know, the nature of this conference, espionage happens, and people are spied on all the time. So if some staffer for some senator who's on an important committee is being targeted by a phishing message, just because that senator happens to be up for election, like a lot of the senators, doesn't mean it's election related, especially if it's part of a broader campaign. So I draw the line that there has to be some sort of plausible understanding of the operation and what's going on to say that this is related to the election and not the background before I call it. Because if you call everything election related, nothing is. This question, I wrote the question, as I said, a couple of months back. Unfortunately, I don't think I have the answer to it yet. Where is the line between politics and disinformation? I like the hacking side more than the disinformation side. You're either hacking or you're not, right? It's a phishing message, it's not. I look at a YouTube video going, is this disinformation? Is this politics? I don't do the policy side, but it's a lot more complicated. We have, this is an example from Spamiflage Dragon of, one of the 50,000 channels we've taken down from Spamiflage Dragon. Only a small, very tiny number of political. But we took this down under coordinated influence operations, inauthentic behavior. So it's coordinated, it's inauthentic, it's to do with politics, it's easy to take down. But there's a lot more complicated cases, right? State-sponsored media, people using PR firms. One of the big challenges is a great evolution in this space, that it's not all Internet Research Agency from 2016. We now actually have adapting and people straddling that line. So I expect a lot more work in this policy space. So I don't have a clear answer about where the line is, but kind of you know it when you see it. And kind of theme of the conference as of today, is it always the Russians? And yet, no, it is not always the Russians. Of all the things we saw last year, we looked at this as well, and seeing this report come in of voters being threatened by spoofed email accounts claiming to be the Proud Boys, telling them about email, telling them about threats and not to vote. But I did not predict that at the same time I was actually looking at two things that night, and for some reason I was personally doing some analysis for once instead of doing management. And these two things I was looking at once suddenly converged, that my Iranian infrastructure and this Proud Boys threats became the same thing, and we were able to independently attribute this to Iran, and that was not on my bingo card for 2020. But even then, do we know the real intent here? Of was it to actually do the threat? Was it to make it look like there was more internal threats? Intent is tricky, even if it's more tricky than attribution. And again, as I pointed out before, when we actually saw phishing going towards campaigns, it wasn't Russia. Everybody was rushing about the entire year thinking that it was going to be APT28. Everyone was just saying that it was going to be a big repeat of 2016. But no, what we actually saw and observed with regards to the phishing attacks against campaigns was Iran and China. And again, they were not successful as far as we know. And do we know the intent? Was it espionage? Was it influence? But it's something we came out with and went public with because we thought it was an important part of the conversation. Is it always a government-backed actor? So people really care about election security, and people get very on edge. And I'd say, people who are on the firing lines, they're kind of like, the little kids sitting on their bed with the blanket over their head. Every time they see a shadow, they think it's a monster. And every time they get some sort of weirdness on their computer, they think it's APT28 coming back. So, we've just because you're in a campaign doesn't mean you're suddenly exempt from getting Nigerian phishing emails or weird marketing stuff or everything else that happens on the internet. So we track down a lot of those, but I think it's great. It's really good that we are looking very closely, and we should look very closely, but it's a sign we have to be very careful because jumping to conclusions here really hurts. And so this is one of the ultimate examples that we was come across here, is that this was somebody phishing, this is a phishing campaign against, I think it was in the primaries, against presidential candidates, sending them to, I think, Google Docs, Google Forms, something which was trying to steal credentials. And, some US government folks, at least one of the sort of security companies here, were kind of going down with yeah, we think this is APT28 because they're doing phishing. Side note, this comes up a lot. There seems to be a lot of people who've come to me in very different forms saying, we're seeing a threat actor going after political targets, sending them to face login pages, therefore we think it's Russia. If anyone doesn't realize that every single nation just about that's doing threat act is using that TTP, that it's not enough to do attribution. But in this case, we were actually able to see the attribution, and it subsequently came out publicly in this indictment. It was actually a 18 or 19-year-old making some kind of poor life choices here to send this out, and they were for some reason decided this would be a good thing to do and play this game. And yeah, it was a 19-year-old McDonald's worker, not APT28, and that subsequently came out. But quite luckily, we and others were able to work that out. But imagine the media cycle if it had come out that this was APT28 and somebody had jumped to that other conclusion. So what do you do when you find something? This is a tough question. Be prepared for it. I'd say the main thing you have to do is strap in, you're in for a ride. Because if you find something, you suddenly, as a platform especially, we're sort of under the obligation. As I said, we're asked by a lot of serious people many times a day whether we've seen something. So the day that went from no to yes, we knew we actually had to go public and say something about it. But whenever you say something about election security, especially if you're coming from some sort of position of power, like being a major platform, you are going to be injecting yourself into the news cycle in an election. And I'll tell you what, the one thing campaigns are trying to do is control their news cycle. So if you are saying something, you are getting into the news cycle and potentially messing up these careful plans about how they want the news cycle to go. So my biggest advice is make sure that you can stand by everything you say and that you're right. It's not the time to take some really marginal evidence and jump to some conclusions just to get a PR cycle. I think it'll blow up on you. But the other thing I can say is just work out what you're going to do, be principled about it. In our case, our principles were that we thought this was going to become public, it had to become public. We knew it would leak around, so we did inform the people being targeted, but we believed we had to get that into the public conversation. And then you just have to stand by your principles. And you are going to get criticism. Everybody thinks that they should be given a heads up and be told first. But by definition, if you tell everybody first, you're basically just making it public. So you have to make your calls, live by it, and take the criticism and just hope to do the right thing. So with all that, that's sort of my rough rundown of like some of the ways that I've been thinking about election security, how we see it. Hopefully, if any of you are involved in that, maybe it's useful as we go into the future election cycles. God help us. Thank you.